Hello, everyone, and welcome to a late night author interview on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining me today is an indie author making her official debut here on the channel. She is an indie
Hi.
author. She is an indie author who self-published her first book this year, 2024. With several more projects in the works, you can look forward to seeing her pop up more and more in different genres and styles. By day, she's a health professional and high school science teacher, and she has an adorable Spitfire of a daughter and two cats, and currently lives in Virginia for the moment. And she is here now to tell us all about her books, and one in particular, The Cursed Thief. So let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, indie author Natasha Yentrouc. Natasha, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's awesome to be here. Awesome. I always love talking about my books.
Excellent. So, before we dive into your books, Natasha, is there anything else you'd like to add about your background for our viewers and listeners?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, I've always loved writing for especially since high school. And this writing journey has been super therapeutic for me. So I love sort of discussing um, the mental health aspects of everything as well. We all have our struggles, and
Mm,
it plays a big role for me. So I love to kind of dive in and take it deeper than just the writing.
nice. Very, very good. And speaking of your writing, Natasha, can you give our viewers a little teaser of the books you've written from The Cursed Thief and your other two?
Absolutely. So The Cursed Thief is my novel, and I took D&D character classes and brought them to life. So there's several main characters. It's sort of if a D&D adventure was turned into a novel. That's kind of how I imagined it. But it explores a lot of themes of particularly things like grief and trauma, um, which is something that is very personal to me.
Mm,
And then I have The Doctor's Dilemma, which is my first book. It's a novella, it's werewolves, vampires, love story, adventure, also a lot of dark themes.
ooh.
Um, so different, yeah, lot of stuff going on in that one. I have been told that um, well, my one friend, he put it the best. He was like, "I hate you for the ending, but it was perfect." So read into that what as you will. Um,
That's always the best when readers say, "Why did you do this to me? The book was amazing, but why did you do this in the
yes,
ending?" It's like it gets them hooked for
exactly.
continuation.
Exactly. Yes. He was like, it fits so well, but I hated it. So I count that as a win. It's a big win for me. And then my third book, it's actually I don't even think it counts as a novella. It's very, very short. I think it's a novelette, technically.
All right.
That one is called It Doesn't Matter Anymore. And it is a post apocalyptic lit fic, because that's
Ooh,
exactly what you would expect from someone who's written two fantasy stories.
nice. Yeah. Well, as based on your Mile, you like to write, different styles of stories, different characters, which shows that you are a very versatile author. So I'm actually curious, Natasha, were you always like a very creative person growing up, or did that come later in life?
Um, that's a good question. I think I have always been pretty creative. I had kind of a rough childhood. So a lot of what I experienced and what I thought of myself, um, I'm not sure exactly if that was actually me or if it was a result of my circumstances, right?
Mm.
So I've always sort of been a very like straightforward, logical math science brain, and that's how most of my family would describe me. Um, but as I've gotten older, and in particularly in this last year, I've really come to embrace the more creative side of myself. And I think that that has always been there. But it was not necessarily, I was not in a safe place to express that growing up. So I've always been creative, but I have not always expressed myself creatively. And so I actually really struggled with writing, even when I was younger. I feel like I've told this story a bunch of times. A lot of people probably have already heard it, or read it on my Instagram or whatever. But I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and my mom was my English teacher, and because I was homeschooled, and
Mm.
we were trying to work on writing, and so she asked me to write a sentence, and I wrote like the dog sat, and she was just so frustrated at that point because I that was typical for me. She asked me to write a sentence, so I very literally wrote a sentence. That was the simplest sentence that I could think of, and she was like, "Let's try to describe the dog. How did the dog sit?" She's like, "Pull out an adverb, pull out an adjective." And I mean, we were like both in tears by the end of it. I think I ended up with like the brown dog sat quickly or something like that. Like
All right.
it was a long drawn out thing. And so I don't think she would think that I was very creative at writing.
Mm.
um,
Okay.
but it's gotten a lot better. And at this point, writing is how I've processed a lot of things, a lot of trauma in particular. So um, yes and no to your question.
All right. Fascinating. Fascinating. So, what would you say in your life was the aha moment when you wanted to jump into the pool of the publishing world? And can you share with us what that experience was like, that decision?
Um, well, I remember it pretty specifically, actually. I think I was scrolling through Instagram Reels, as one does. I
Mm-hmm.
am 29, so I am too old for TikTok. So that's why I was on Instagram. And I saw one of those, unhinged book talk reels or whatever it was, where they were talking about one of those absolutely ridiculously wild books. I think it was a romance book. I think it was the one about the door. I think it's like called Unhinged or something, where a woman falls in love with the door or whatever. And
Of course,
I
why
just
not?
remember, yeah, of course, yeah. It was either that one or the one about the Vikings that fight vampires. I don't know if you've seen that one go around. That one, it was really interesting at one point too.
No, but that actually sounds like a pretty good read.
Oh man, it's a whole thing. It's like there's time travel and then there's Vikings, and you're reading this blurb, and every single sentence you would never expect, and you're like, okay, that was not the sentence I was expecting. Anyway, it was one of these, you know, reels that, and I was sitting there and I was like, I have always made up stories. I've always considered myself a daydreamer, sometimes to my own detriment, to the point where I have always, in order to fall asleep at night, I have to tell myself stories. So I've been rehashing and writing these stories in my brain my whole life. And I finally, it was, as I was seeing one of these reels, I was like, I know my stories are not necessarily better than, but they're at least as entertaining as these are. I don't, there's, I'm of the opinion that there's not really good or bad writing. Technically,
Right.
yes, but not content wise. So
Mm.
I'm like, if that's your thing, that's great. But like, I also know my stories would resonate with somebody. So I started looking into it, and I decided to write down this story that I'd had in my brain for forever. That was the doctor's dilemma. And it came pretty easily. I wrote it I just passed my year anniversary. I started writing
Ooh.
last October, And by January, I was editing, and I think I published it in February. I didn't do anything for it. I kind of just dropped it out there in the middle of the ether and was like, hey, I did it, you know? So that was sort of my aha moment of, okay, I can, you know, I want to do this. And then I essentially just did all the wrong things and didn't do any of the things that anybody says to do with marketing or writing group or finding
Mhm.
ARCs, or I didn't even know what any of that was. I just sort of said, you know, hit the publish button because I wanted to prove that I could.
You
In
know what? That
particular, yeah,
Oh, no, I was gonna say, you know what? Sometimes that's all we have to like. We have this
yeah,
story, we want to share it, and
yeah,
at that point, we don't really think of the other stuff. We just want to get our story out there.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I've never written for anybody else. It's always just been for me. It's just been to put my stories out there. I've always sort of said that if no one else reads my stories, I will. And I do. I have reread my own books, you know, beyond editing and beyond all of that stuff. I've reread my own stuff several times, just because. And I still love them as much as the day that I wrote them.
Same here. Same here with mine. I still read. In fact, I'm even rereading my first two books for
Oh, that's awesome.
a series on my channel called the audio series for people who, haven't purchased a book yet but want to like read it and like listen to it. So I'm narrating like 3 chapters a week. And it's really it's what's the word I'm thinking of? When we reread our own works as we, get older in our careers as authors, it really makes us think like, oh wow, I could have done this, I could have changed that.
Yes.
It's almost like with actors who like, watch their old films or old roles, and it's like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? But you know what? We grow as authors and as people too,
Hmm.
and we only get better as time goes on. So now, Natasha, let's actually focus on the writing your stories and the process that went into. I'm starting with Doctor's Dilemma. So when you began writing Doctor's Dilemma, what was the goal you had going forward with this book, as well as your promises to your future readers? And has that carried over to your other two books, The Cursed Thief and the other one?
I call it IDMA for short. So yeah, that the other one. That's a good name for it. So I always find that one hard to describe. People are like, "Oh, what is that one about?" And I'm like, "Well, you, I don't know. You have to read it and just be warned. Read the content warnings." Anyway, um, so with the Doctor's Dilemma, initially I just set out to sort of make an entertaining story, right?
Right.
Especially in that particular, I hate to call it a genre, but werewolf vampire books are basically their own genre, right? Um,
Right.
the difference is that this book is not a romance. I learned very quickly, um, those definitions are pretty hard lines. I know there's still some debate that rages on what makes a romance. Um, it is not a romance. There is a love story inside of it, but is not primarily a romance. So that sort of set it apart. But really, the point was just to be entertaining. Um, as I got into the book, and then after I had actually written it, I realized that there were two sort of themes that were explored in there. One is this idea of family, and of belonging. And the other is sort of the idea of being split between two worlds. And
Okay.
both of those things resonate deeply for me, particularly with my immediate biological family as well as the fact I have I have I'm on the autism spectrum. So for me, my whole life, I have sort of ended up feeling like I am not quite autistic enough to fit in with a lot of the autistic community, at least growing up. Nowadays, I feel like there's a lot more room and there's a lot more awareness of a spectrum there.
Right.
Growing up, if you weren't sort of the very stereotypical, like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, teenage boy sort
Right.
of thing, you like weren't really autistic. And so that was difficult. So I didn't fit in with your neurotypicals, but I didn't necessarily fit in with the autism community at the time. So I've
Mm.
always sort of felt like this weird split of like, I don't really belong in either space. And so what I realized after I had written this book, this is a theme that will come back for me, is that those were really the things that I was sort of hoping that my readers would recognize. I was hoping that they would recognize um, these pieces of me in this book, whether it was this idea of feeling like you didn't quite fit in any place, or this idea of um, family and belonging, and not necessarily being accepted by your family of origin, not necessarily feeling like you had a connection with your family other than, well, you're related to them. So I am not sure. I haven't had a ton of people read that book. It's my first one. I don't expect it to. Like I said, I dropped it with no drama, no anything. So
Mm.
I haven't had a ton of people read that or give feedback, but I do hope that maybe someone can find that book and they can identify with it. I don't advertise it as either of those things, simply because it is a personal experience, and there are parts of the book where I think maybe people would read wrongly into what I'm saying about autism or mothers or family experiences. And so I try not to make that super like in your face here, this is what this is actually about. But
Right.
ultimately that's what it is for me. And I feel like it's one of those things where if you know, you know. And so if you go into that book and you've had any of the similar experiences that I have, you'll recognize it right away. If you haven't, awesome. I'm so glad. And you will never recognize any of it. And that's cool too.
You know, interestingly, a lot of my authors that I've had on the show, a few of them, are very much, of the same mindset. Natasha, from their own personal experiences, they incorporate a piece of themselves
Yeah.
into the story and weave it in. And they've even talked to other authors who've done the same thing. And sometimes
Mhm.
the blend is good. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult because you
Yeah.
are bringing a part of yourself into this story in whatever genre it lies in, and sometimes it's a little difficult and uncomfortable. So
Yes.
as you yeah so from that jumping point going into your other two books,
Hmm.
what was the feedback like as you grew as an author? Were the reviews positive? Were they negative? Or were they somewhere down the middle as you continued on your journey?
So, ultimately, they my novel has still gotten the absolute most reviews, which I did all of the things for that one. I had 50 plus ARC readers. I had a whole writing group where a lot of people ended up reading it and reviewing it for me. Um, like that one made maybe not the biggest splash, but like realistically that is still like it's got, I don't even know, I think I'm up to like 13 or 14 reviews on that one, whereas the other ones have almost nothing. So I don't know that it's necessarily a trajectory of as I've gotten better or as I've grown in my writing. That one sort of is still sitting at the top, which is really cool. And honestly, that one probably more than either of the other ones has a huge amount of me in it. I am in every single character in some aspect.
All right.
And the main character in particular, ironically, her story is very hard. It's very dark. And
Mm.
it's still, her life is still arguably quite a bit better than mine was. So um, it's hard to read at points because I remember what I was thinking and how I was writing it. I actually, again, didn't realize the point of what I was writing until I was probably about 75% of the way through.
Okay.
Yeah, so, but the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive from all of them. I'm surprised. I actually, my third book, my IDMA, my little whatever it is not an easy book. I wrote it start to finish, basically final polished in 6 days. Yeah, it sort of sprang out of me fully completed. I don't even know. I just sort of wrote for like 6 days, just wrote, took off. I pictured the cover. I made it in about 15 minutes. I think I spent maybe an hour editing it after I had set it down for a while and just went through and edited it, and that was it. I was like, I'm done. Blurb was done in maybe an hour. Like, this thing crawled out of me alive and kicking. And it is the darkest book. It is laden with huge, huge, huge emotions. And I again, that's the one I always sort of warn people when they like ask what I've written. I'm like, well, The Doctor's Dilemma, The Cursed Thief, they're pretty standard. Like, if you like werewolves, you probably like The Doctor's Dilemma. If you like straight up fantasy, D&D, quest, adventure, that sort of thing, you probably like The Cursed Thief. If you like really supremely sad books like The Dog Stars or I Who Have Never Known Men, you're going to like Idmore, which is not everybody's cup of tea. And yet, that's the only book to date that has gotten somebody picked it up off of Amazon, read it, and then left it a 5-star review. And I have no idea who this person is. They're actually not even based in the US. They left just the most lovely little review about this book, and they were like, it's beautiful, it's touching. I'm like, this book has the F word like 75 times. So, okay, sure. Sure. If that's how you felt about it, I'm so glad. So yeah, I almost feel like that one has the most positive reviews, because it's like out of 3 reviews, it's got like 4.7 stars, and it just, people really like it. Whoever has read it, I don't know. I don't even know who they are.
Well, that's awesome. That is really, really good to hear, Natasha. Now, still on the topic of reviews, from the reviews you have for all 3 of your books, do they in a way validate your goal that you set out with, which was, to tell just really good stories?
It does. It's hard to walk the line, as I'm sure you know, as all authors know, right? Of this idea of like, you don't really need the external validation. And yet, when you are writing books. They are entertainment. They are meant to be entertaining. So people have to like them. Like,
Yeah.
that is the point, right? Like, ultimately, I can say, oh, I've written these for myself and I like them, and that's great. But ultimately, if you're really truly measuring any sort of measure of success of an entertainment medium, it has to be entertaining. People have to enjoy it. So, yes, I feel like ultimately I have found people who enjoy the stories that I tell. And I have had, particularly with The Cursed Thief, I had many, many people who said that they were really touched by a lot of the philosophy that I put in there, a lot of the trauma and the grief and the working through these things that I put in there, and they resonated with that. And so, yes, I think I've not only entertained, but I think I have touched people. I have one reader who she tags me in things all the time. And, if people ask to, drop an author, she'll drop my name and she'll message me randomly and be like, I still think about this book every couple of days. It just pops into my brain. And that's like the biggest compliment.
I have the exact same feeling. I have a really, really close bond and friendship with a fellow author based in South Africa. And, she does the exact same thing. Every time that there's a author drop or an author shout out on Instagram, she always tags me in any post that she can. And it is, it's really an incredible, feeling. We've been friends, virtual friends now for about, I want to say 2018. So it's now going on 6 years now, 7 years by the start of, the new year. So it's just amazing. And that helps, us authors, as you talk about, we don't really seek validation, external validation, but you're right, Natasha. We're creating books. We're writing something that's going to entertain people or make people sad or make them laugh or just captivate them in a story that they cannot put down, that they have to read in one night. And that leads to the first reflective question, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on, Natasha, which is, as you said before, like, writing a book is, it's not an easy thing. It's not a get rich quick scheme that, I've seen a lot of times on social media. It's not. It's hours and hours, if not years, just writing the outline, then writing the draft, then fine tuning as best as possible, getting beta readers to review it before you send it to an editor. And especially for indie authors, as I've said numerous times in previous interviews, it's all on us. Cover art, editor, ISBNs, everything is all on us. And especially now in the digital age where we now have a much wider platform to showcase our work, it's a double-edged sword. Yes, we can showcase our work a lot more freely and openly. However, because of social media, anxiety and stress is elevated tenfold, and imposter syndrome comes with vengeance. So, Natasha, for you, have you ever had, those thoughts of anxiety, imposter syndrome, or any other negative feeling that may have impacted or hindered your writing? But what has disciplined you to continue writing? And I remember one person said this on my show, which was, when I started writing, my first book, I didn't know if I was going to have it in me to continue, yet I kept going because I love writing. I love to write stories, regardless of what other people say.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a good question. Um uh yeah, I often joke that I am an imposter because I use a pen name, so I am truly a fake. Um but at the same time, I am a published author. Um as for what keeps me going, honestly, it is not taking it too seriously. And I feel like a lot of people disagree with me on this, and I have a lot of author friends that disagree with me on this. I tend to have friends who are authors who this is their thing. Like, they are writers to their core,
Right.
and they have so much to say, and they want to do so much good with their writing. Like, whether it's the person who's just like, I just want to entertain people and make them forget everything. Like, absolutely, that's a valid thing. I have friends who are, I want to change the world with my writing because I have important things to say and important things to discuss. And I feel like people need my writing. Also, absolutely valid. And they take it very seriously, and they are very, very on top of and very aware of the fact that, like, they need to write and they need to be on their social media and they need to market their books because they want to make a living, want to say their piece, they want to do all of these things. And I absolutely applaud them for that, and I love them for that. And that's absolutely not me. I do not disparage them for that, but for me, I am writing and I deliberately keep myself, I hold it very lightly. Obviously, it is something really important to me. It has helped me process huge, huge amounts of trauma that have happened to me, things that have come up for me in a lot of repressed memories in this past year. It's been a wild year since I started writing, and it's been a wild year because I started writing. So I'm eternally grateful, but it's a hobby for me. I have no aspirations of ever truly making money from this. I have no aspirations of being famous, being known. I would love for people to read my books so that I can talk to them about my books. This is not my career. I do not have a degree in writing. I do not want a degree in writing. I don't want to be a famous bestseller. Like, none of those things have anything to do with me and what I write for. So for me, holding it very lightly and sort of treating it as, if this is something that I end up still enjoying in 20 years or 10 years or 5 years or 5 months, then great, and I will do it as long as I enjoy it. The minute I stop enjoying it, okay, then I won't write until I enjoy it again, if I ever do. I simply don't feel like it is something that I have to do, that I need to do, that I just desperately want to do. It is just so much fun. And I'm so grateful for a world where someone like me, who doesn't have the money or time or effort to invest in a traditional style of publishing, can still publish my little stories and get them out there. Like, this isn't a career for me, so I cannot spend all of my extra time and extra income pouring into marketing and publishing and, thousands of dollars on designs and all of these things, or even hundreds of dollars on these things. The most I've ever spent is getting character art done for the Cursed Thief, and that was sort of a special gift to myself with a little bit of extra money that I had. I have designed all my covers because I can do that for free in Canva. I have, I like, those are the types of things that I have done because to me it's not that serious, and I'm not willing to invest everything that I have in it. And some would say, well, you're not going to get everything out of it, right? Like, you give,
Right.
you get what you give, which is fine by me. I'm okay with this being a side hobby, with this being something like that. And honestly, that has made the biggest difference because I've been able to treat it like a hobby, and I've been able to simply have fun with it. And if I don't feel like writing today, then I don't write. And if
You know,
I do feel like writing today, then I write.
you honestly, Natasha, you hit the nail on the head, and that pretty much summarized, everything I've talked with all my guests on my show, because they all say the same thing, especially a recent guest who I had. He is Amazon best-selling author, and for him, he even said the same thing. Like, don't go into writing or in this industry trying to make money. Don't start off with that. But for him, he wanted to be successful, so he had to have that mindset. And a lot of my other
Yeah.
authors, they have the same thing. Like, they enjoy writing, they do put effort into their books, but they don't put, all the effort into sense that, they want to make a career out of this. They enjoy writing, they become passionate for it, but they still have their other thing on the side. And
Yeah.
one of my guests actually said, the moment you turn your passion into almost like a business or a job, not to say that writing isn't already a job in and of itself, but if you make it a job in the sense that you have a deadline of when you want to publish the book, of when you want to promote the book and stuff like that, then your passion for writing is not going to be fun. And readers who have followed you are going to notice a change in your style of writing, because it is a commitment to transition from simply writing as a hobby to writing commercial. And sometimes not everyone is for, writing for commercial. Sometimes you just want to just write because it's a hobby and they do like to share their work. So you know what? I completely understand. I was of the same mindset. I want to write commercial. And I still do just a little bit, but not as much as I did before when I started back in 2018, 2020. Now I just write on the side. I'm passionate about my writing, but
Yeah.
not as I was before. And that just comes with, trial and error and, experience. And
Yeah.
speaking of trial and error, now let's sort of turn to, the business side of being an author. Now, I know you said just now that that mindset's not really one of the motivating or the big drives for your writing, but I am curious on these certain aspects. So, for you, Natasha, all writers want to understand their audience, who they're writing for, because for us, when we write our books, we're the target audience. But when we share our stories, when we publish them, we have to think, okay, who's going to actually read this and what genre would this belong to? So, Natasha, for all three of your books, did you have a good idea of who your audience was, as well as your readership?
Um, I don't think I did at the beginning, like when I started writing them. I think by the end, I had a better idea, and particularly as I got more involved in the quote unquote book scene, I guess would be a good way to put it. So, yeah, I think that, with the Doctor's Dilemma, I struggle still even to market that one simply because I think I when I started writing it, I thought, well, it's werewolves and vampires. Like those stories are everywhere. There's a huge audience. People will want to read this. But what I have come to realize is, again, most of those stories that are very popular with those two things, within that sort of supernatural, um, or it kind of depends even on what you call it. Some people would consider it paranormal. Some
Right.
people would consider it supernatural. Some people would even consider it like a monster kind of a thing. Some
Right.
people consider it Omegaverse, whatever you want to call it. Um, Typically, the very popular ones are romances, and
Yes.
so it's hard to market a book that's like that. Where I know that people who like stories that are romances within that genre, I know they will like it. But at the same time, if the only reason that they read that genre is for the romance and particularly for the spice, They will
Yes.
not like this book. That is one of the other difficult things, and yet it puts me into a niche, is that I write exclusively no spice books. So the Doctor's Dilemma and It Doesn't Matter Anymore have zero spice. I think that in IDMA there is a mention, like an off the, like, sort of a um
Like a casual
random
remark, kind of.
mention. Yes, yeah. Whereas in the Doctor's Dilemma, there's a makeout session, and that's as far as it goes. There's nothing else in there. And so that has created a totally, right, that's like a totally different section of readership, particularly in today's book market. And I am not against spice in books. I'm not against open door romance. Like, you read whatever you want to read. I really am for that. I personally don't read spice. I have read friends' books with like open door romance and stuff in there for them, simply to help them out. But I don't read it for fun.
Right.
And I don't write it. And so it's an interesting niche because there's a lot of discourse around that part of the readership as well, because there's a lot of people who, when they read a book and they're looking for something without any with that closed door policy, or whatever you want to call it, they're very often also looking for what would be someone called clean fiction. And I
Yes,
know
I've heard of
there's
that.
a lot of talk about that term, and a lot of people don't like it. The problem is that clean, or whatever that term encompasses, it very often also has connotations of there's no swearing, there's no violence. It's almost like very young adult, right? Where you're the expectation is that there's certain boundaries that aren't crossed. Well,
Right.
there is a subset of us, myself included, where the Doctor's Dilemma gets very gory, but there's no spice. It Doesn't Matter Anymore is not particularly gory. There's a lot of swearing, but there's also no spice. The Cursed Thief deals with very dark themes. There are a lot of themes of even things like self-harm, child loss, child neglect, like really serious things. There's murder. There's all these different things in there, but there's no spice. It's all fade to black. There is off-page mention of other things, but there's nothing explicit in there. And so when some people are looking for something that is quote unquote clean, I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? So
Right.
finding my readership has been really interesting, because I think that for the Doctor's Dilemma, it's difficult because there's not a true romance story and there's not spice in it. So it kind of drops it off of the it drops it off of the list of things that are going to be really popular. And that's okay. It doesn't need to be really popular, but I know that there's people out there who would like that. I just have to find them. For the Cursed Thief, I'm like, well, if you like fantasy and you like Dungeons and Dragons, that's great. But unfortunately, even the fantasy genre has it has been taken over by fantasy with romance, whether that's romantasy or
Yeah.
fantasy romance or any of those subgenres. Again, there are love stories in there. There are very sweet love stories, and it has LGBTQ representation all over the place. And it has, these very cool interwoven stories, but it's not a romance and there's no spice. And so it doesn't really fall into the same category as things when a lot of people think of a popular fantasy series.
Right.
And then it doesn't matter anymore. Litfic, if you, literary fiction, I should explain what that is when the characters drive the story, not the plot. Which
I've heard of that.
is, yes. So when you think of a lot of classics, we go back to things like The Great Gatsby, or even 1984, or even something like The Metamorphosis would be a great example of a literary fiction. It's as opposed to genre fiction. Literary fiction is driven by character and a character arc, as opposed to action or driving plot.
Right.
And so literary fiction is one of the hardest things to market in today's market, I suppose you could say, because most people are not looking for something like that anymore. It's typically something you'd see in a literature class, or an English class or a writing class. You want to study it and see kind of what are the characters thinking? What is the author illustrating here? I'm not saying my book is up to that caliber. I'm just saying that's the idea that people get when you think of lit fic. And
Right.
so to take something that's this very irreverent post-apocalyptic literary fiction book and be like, here, let's market this. There really isn't a way to market it. And so I haven't found the readership for that one yet. I know that they're out there, but man, it's hard if you're not writing one of these bigger genres. And I know a lot of people have spoken about that, and that's nothing against the bigger genres. I think it's great that we have this revival of people reading more and more and more and more, whatever it is. I don't care if you're reading, Monster Smut. Like, cool, you're reading. That's awesome. You found a hobby. But it does make it difficult for the rest of us who write in smaller niches or smaller genres or things that are just harder to market. They're not TikTok worthy,
Right. Natasha, you're nailing it with like all these comments, because you know what, you're all right. So the romance fantasy genre that I've had mentioned numerous times on the show, as one of my guests said, it is the most read genre out of all the genres combined. I think it's read 6 months or 6 times more than any other genre of book in like 6 months. And again, we're not trying to bash romance fantasy. I'm glad that people are enjoying romance fantasy, but it is difficult when you're trying to write outside, the norms or the trends that are, happening in the publishing world, because there's always going to be something new, and it's very, very challenging. So that's why, Natasha, I'm going to combine these two questions together. So brace yourselves. This will kind of be a heavy hitter. So one of my guests on my show, we talked about, who are the authors who inspired you to help you gain your voice as an author. But he switched it on me. He said, I could tell you all the authors that have helped me, and I am. But at the end of the day, it's still my work, my voice in my book, because that's the thing I want people to understand. I'm not trying to be like Stephen King. I'm not trying to be like George R. Martin. I'm not trying to be like the author of The Fourth Wing or author of The Hunger Games or anyone like that. I am showcasing my work. And I'm sure you may have also seen, Natasha, books that have had this tagline, so-and-so meets so-and-so. From a reader's perspective, that gets our attention. From an author's perspective, it may not be helpful, because that pigeonholes us into either one style of writing, one genre, or one classification of authorship. And we don't want to be classified as one or the other. We want to showcase our own work. And as we grow, I've come to realize that there's like two paths for authors: those who wish to be authors and those who wish to be known as authors, which are two very different things. One is dedicated to storytelling, not motivated by capital. The other is motivated by marketing to showcase their work. And each path has their own, hurdles. But for first-time authors getting into this industry, the second path is the most enticing, which unfortunately leads to unrealistic goals and expectations, which culminates to this statement, which I love sharing with my guests, which is there is no guarantee in this industry your first book's going to get you the gratification you're looking for. There are exceptions to that, of course, like everything else, but generally speaking, your first book is not going to guarantee you your status in this industry. Even when you're trying to balance, your individuality as an author, but still showing reverence and respect to the books of the past and the authors of the past. So for you, Natasha, what are your thoughts on this? So first part, how have you balanced your individuality as an author, but also showcasing, the stories of the past in terms of how you approach certain characters, certain themes, plot elements, and so forth. And also the second part, what are your thoughts on this comment that, in this industry, there is no guarantee your first book is going to be the start of your legacy if you wish to be a successful commercial fiction writer, but it shouldn't deter you from writing stories if that's something you truly want to do?
Oh man. Yeah, that's a great question, or set of questions, I should say.
Yeah, it's a heavy hitter.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the first part. Oh man. I think that ultimately looking at stories as all pretty much boiling down to the same elements has really helped me. So, you know, my first book is werewolves and vampires. There's nothing revolutionary there. It really isn't. I think I like to think that I put a little bit of a twist on it because again, it's not a romance, and so I was given a
Right.
little more leeway. And I added in my own like vampire lore and werewolf lore and that sort of thing. So it is unique, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it is one in a million of the same basic type of books, and it is not like revolutionizing the genre. It's not stuff that I invented. It's not stuff that I came up with. I read, a bazillion books just like it on Inkitt and Wattpad back in the day.
Right.
So I like to think that I did add my own flair. And again, there were very important themes in it to me. Themes of family and belonging. But it was delivered in a vehicle that is sort of like a Toyota Camry where like everybody has it, like the driver of the car is interesting, but the car itself isn't. So with the Cursed Thief, again, it is a fetch quest. How do you make a 90,000 word fetch quest? A lot of writing,
Right.
like it really is just a lot of describing things and a lot of contriving different things to make plot happen. It is literally a D&D adventure that drags on for, almost 90,000 words. Like that is what it is. It's not revolutionary. I fully recognize that I pulled elements, some of it not straight from some of my favorite books, but very, very heavily inspired by some of my very favorite books. And I think that's okay. It has my own flavor. It has my own spin. I know that nobody can tell that story like I did, despite the fact that there are a million other books out there that are fantasy adventure quests. It's the plot of a ton of video games. It's the plot of a ton of movies. It's the plot of almost every, young adult fantasy. Like it is what it is. And it's funny because Idma is probably my most unique book, and even that is very heavily inspired by some of my favorite literary fiction,
Mm,
particularly the post-apocalyptic ones that I've already mentioned. So
right.
it is not, it's not groundbreaking, but it is uniquely mine in the same way that anytime you have a conversation with somebody, they add in their own little flares. They're not inventing new words. They're using all the same words and very often the same sentences that everybody else on the planet uses. And yet there are certain mannerisms and certain facial expressions and certain pronunciations and certain little breaks that they put in things that make it a uniquely um, interesting conversation that's happening that can only happen with that person. And that's
Right.
how stories are. We're all telling the same stories through our own lens.
Right.
So that's sort of how I would address that first question. For the second question, oh man,
It's a
it
tough one.
is. Yeah, it is. It's hard. Again, I am grateful that I have always sort of treated this as it's a hobby and I don't expect to get famous or well known or anything. Um, I just want people to read my books because I would love to chat with them about it and I hope that it touches somebody. But when it comes to this idea of the first book does not guarantee success, I would say the 10th book doesn't guarantee success. I think that probably a vast majority of what happens to very famous authors or people who become very famous authors is luck and timing.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and you can do all of the right things and do all of the right marketing and write the best book, but ultimately you have to be in the right place at the right time and find the right person or the right agent or the right publishing company or have somebody pick up your book one day. You get people who are very, very, very famous, and very often it's their 15th book that takes off. I think about the people that I love to read. I very rarely love their first book. I'm not like, oh my gosh, I found this debut author and I really love them. Obviously, my indie friends are different. But very often you pick up a book and then you realize this author has 9 other books that they've written. And that's just pretty typical.
Right.
Having a backlist is super, super common. It's very true of any media. You very rarely find a famous singer or musician where it's their first album that gets famous. Very often it's one song that's 10 years into their career, and then all of a sudden that's when their first album takes off because everybody goes to their backlist and is like, oh my gosh, their early stuff was great.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with actors. You very rarely have somebody in a breakout role, their very first role. Half the time, they've done little tiny things for 15 or 20 years and then they get their big break.
Right.
It's the nature of the industry, and unfortunately, particularly with books, it is a saturated market, and particularly if you're not writing in very specific popular genres, or you don't happen to have the backing of a very famous person, a very famous name, a very famous publishing house, whatever it may be, you're probably not going to have some great breakout success. And I've seen lots of indies who have pretty good debuts. and they're still not making a living off of it, like
Right.
it's, nobody is hitting their first book, even if they make 1,000,000 pages on KDP in their first year, or they're doing, they've sold, 1,500 copies of their book or whatever. That's still not like full-time living wage. So it doesn't really matter if that's your goal. That's a great start, but it's still not where you need to be. It's a long-term process. It just is.
Absolutely. And you've probably given, I'm not going to lie on this, Natasha, you've probably given the most well thought out answer to this question than any of my previous guests I've had on the show. And up to now, you would be guest number almost 100. I think you're guest
Oh, wow.
number 97 or 98. And you've probably given one of the best, if not the best response to this question, which I honestly love. And it definitely gives a lot of context and weight to it because it is absolutely true. Everything you said, Natasha, is absolutely true. And, it's all about, timing and the place of who you want to be and where do you see yourself down the road with your passion. And
Yeah.
we are near the end of this incredible interview, Natasha. So, as the final two questions, which are kind of like a nice little ending to this session, what would you say, or say, who would you like to give a shout out to your fellow author friends on social media who have really helped you grow as an author and sort of helped you understand the nuances of being an indie author in particular? And with everything you've learned thus far from your 3 books, Idma, The Cursed Thief, and The Doctor's Dilemma, what is your word of wisdom to the writers and future authors who are listening or watching this interview right now?
Oh man. Okay. Um, there's so many people I could shout out. I have so many friends. I've found such a great community, and had so many great experiences. I would have to probably shout out the same people that I typically shout out, but it's because they're amazing. So that would be Michael James. He's an author. He does mostly cozy fantasy, some like urban cozy fantasy. He's got a new ARC out right now, from his book that I have read, I think 3 times now somehow, and it's amazing. So excited. He's been doing this a while, but he also has the same sort of perspective that I do on like, this is supposed to be fun, and we have to constantly keep reminding ourselves of that.
Yes.
And then Varun Gwalani, he's an Indian author. I actually have worked with him as his PA for some time now as well. And he has such a wide variety of books. He, like me, cannot decide what genre he likes or wants to write, so he writes them all. He's got 6 books out, a 7th one coming. He's got 8 on the shelf, waiting to be picked up. He's doing stuff. He's making moves. And his art of storytelling, like he is an artist, like we're all artists, but he is like, there's something about him that it's like in his blood. It's amazing. It's so, so, so good. Oh man, there are so many others that I could name. Amy H writes amazing romance, and has given me so much support, and she's just such a wonderful, lovely person. Greg Neiman writes just the weirdest, most offbeat things, and I love it. There's so many I could name like for hours and hours, but I guess I will stop there. As for advice, and I feel weird giving any advice, but a word of wisdom or maybe it's just a nugget of truth, really, is all it is.
All right.
Is that if you want to write, unfortunately, you have to write. You have to actually put words on the paper, and no Instagram aesthetic and no amazing TikTok reels and no perfectly curated hashtags and no amazing character art will substitute for that. You have to put words on the page, and then you have to delete words off the page and put better words on the page. And
That
that's
is
sort of all there is to it.
that is 100% true. You have to put the story down on the page. No amount of aesthetic is going to change that. Yes, it could get people hyped for the
Oh yeah,
story, but at the end of the day, you still have to write the story and
right.
bring it to life. And
Yeah.
I think that is a perfect ending for this amazing late night author interview. Now, Natasha, before we officially end, where can people find you on social media, and where can people buy copies of The Curse Thief, Doctor's Dilemma, and Idma?
Okay, so I am on Instagram and Threads and TikTok as I think it's natasha.yentrouc.author. And then on Facebook, it's Natasha Yentrouc, author. And then I do have a website, which is author Natasha Yentrouc. The other domain was unfortunately taken somehow. I don't know. So I do have a website, and I do have a newsletter and all of that stuff. And then for my books, they're all on Amazon. They're all currently also on Kindle Unlimited. So I know there's all the debate on Amazon right now. It is what it is. That's where they are. I have neither the time nor the energy nor the crayons to make them go wide. So for now, they are there. I do run sales and stuff. They're all fairly reasonably priced. I have all of them on Kindle. The two bigger ones, The Doctor's Dilemma and The Cursed Thief, are also available in paperback. Idma is just too small, but it is going to be part of an anthology that will be
Ooh.
published in paperback.
Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video, my viewers and listeners. Thank you again for joining us for a late night author interview. A huge thank you to Natasha making her official debut here on the channel. And hopefully it won't be the last time on the show, because Natasha, talking with you, I'm drawn to what you have in store for us, because now you've got me hooked, and I'm pretty sure you got all of the viewers hooked on what you have in store. So viewers, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date. And as always, I will see you all in the next video. You have a wonderful evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you are in the world.